Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Ange Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 1 running back rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses last season were giving up the most points to opposing running backs on a weekly basis on average in a half PPR scoring format. Today's episode is going to be in a half PPR scoring format, meeting everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard or full PPR, so keep that in mind. Now also, after we get past the matchups portion of today's episode, we'll transition to our top 36 running back rankings, as I'll share with you guys my opinions and the stats that justify my rankings as to how I think the position is going to stack up by the end of Week 1. Now, as you can see to the right of me, we already have Jonathan Taylor as my number 1 running back. A little bit of a spoiler, but before we get into all of that information, let me remind you guys, the singular purpose of this channel is to help you win a 2022 Fantasy Football Championship. We'll be accomplishing that with our weekly rankings videos, starter sits, hidden gems. Of course, we'll be doing multiple live streams throughout the week, and on top of it, a waiver wire episode every Monday to make sure that you're getting the perfect players off that waiver list. So of course, do yourself a favor, subscribe to the channel. We'll be making daily content for the entirety of the season. Thank you very much. Final thing I wanted to mention before we begin, if you guys haven't checked out Underdog Fantasy, be sure to do so. For those of you who have already gone ahead and drafted all of your teams this offseason, but still want to play more fantasy football on a weekly basis, Underdog is the best way to do it. Whether it is their weekly contests, I know there's still best ball tournaments going on today, but they're going to have their weekly pick'ems and drafts that you can go ahead and participate in and win yourself some money. So if you go ahead, travel to the description of the video, click on the link. Not only will you be able to put your fantasy skills to the test, but you'll get a deposit match up to $100. So for those of you who are trying to play more fantasy football, that's the way to do it. Use promo code ANGE today. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into the running back conversation for Week 1. Like I mentioned, I want to talk about matchups going into the week. Now, the first column to the immediate right of me has the 2021 defenses and how many points they allowed to opposing running backs on a weekly basis on average last season in a half PPR scoring format. The team at the very top, which is the New York Jets, they were giving up the most points to opposing running backs in terms of rushing stats per week. Now, the primary reason why I focused on rushing statistics alone is because when I did all my research this offseason, the overwhelming evidence that I found in terms of data was in regards to the fact that defenses don't really play a factor as to whether or not your running backs find success in the receiving game. Oftentimes, it is purely just a matter of whether the team that player is on prefers to throw their running backs the ball. For example, the Los Angeles Chargers, in all different circumstances, whether it was an easy or difficult matchup in the receiving game, were always finding success. While on the other end of the spectrum, teams like the San Francisco 49ers or Baltimore Ravens, who didn't target their running backs, didn't do so even in great matchups. So we've gone ahead and taken away the receiving potential and gone ahead and isolated stats in regards to how many rushing stats they allowed via rushing yardage and rushing touchdowns last season. Obviously, the easiest matchups throughout the year, the Jets, the Chargers, the Texans, the Lions, Pittsburgh Steelers, those are fantastic matchups. Now, I don't go ahead and present these statistics trying to convince you that that's going to be the case once again this year, because we know there's free agency. There's teams, moving around players with trades. There was the NFL draft that is going to bring in talent that is certainly going to help or, potentially hurt some defenses overall. But what I've gone ahead and done to the right is I've gone ahead and taken the grades of the entire defense of all teams in terms of run stopping in the National Football League, according to Pro Football Focus, this offseason. Based on those grades, this kind of gives us an idea as to which defenses are more well equipped to stop the run going into this upcoming season, and specifically in Week 1. We'll go ahead and update this as the weeks progress, but as of right now, this is purely how it's going to potentially look like this season. The fact that the New Orleans Saints are the best run-stopping defense in terms of overall grades, highest grade possible is 100. They have a 72 compared to the Bears as a 55. Obviously, they're far more equipped to stop the run, and they've continued to show that year in and year out. All right, now that we've gone ahead and glossed over the matchups for Week 1 of the 2022 season, let's go ahead and let's get right into it. Let's talk about our top 36 running back rankings. Again, do not forget, rankings are subject to change. We are going to be updating these rankings all week long, so if you want my updated rankings, go ahead and check out the Patreon link in the description. And also, Sunday morning, 8 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, I will be here for 2 hours, kickoff with Kirchhoff, with free rankings at all positions, updated for you. So if you want to check that out, I'll be here Sunday morning, live streaming. Thank you. All right, let's talk about this, shall we? Let's get into the conversation regarding Jonathan Taylor. Again, he takes on the Houston Texans, and the immediate stats that you see to the right of me are there to convey a narrative. First and foremost, of course, the Indianapolis Colts take on the Houston Texans. Now, I've gone ahead and put a green check mark because this is an advantageous matchup. Even if it was a neutral matchup, I respect the talent of Jonathan Taylor to get the job done. So I'm looking forward to this matchup overall. Now, in terms of fantasy points allowed, that's how much the Houston Texans were giving up per week last season in a half PPR scoring format. 18.6 just on the ground to rushing statistics alone. That doesn't even include the potential of the receiving game that Jonathan Taylor could certainly get his hand in. Now, last year, of course, Jonathan Taylor found a lot of success against the Houston Texans. Played against them twice, a division rival. In fact, he was able to put up 28.3 points in one game and 24.3 in the other. Now, if you go ahead and just look at the two games, as the Colts took on and absolutely demolished the Houston Texans last year, the total score difference in those two games combined was 62-3. That kind of gives you a little bit of a perspective as to what exactly we can expect this week. Now, obviously, the Colts are going to be fully healthy, and like I've mentioned in previous videos this offseason, they had 9 different starting offensive line combinations. Now that you have your primary starting 5 ready to go, they're going to, just run absolutely through the Houston Texans this week, finding a lot of success. Again, Jonathan Taylor was able to do all of his damage against Houston last year on the ground. 288 rushing yards, a 6.26 yard per carry average, and 4 rushing touchdowns against them. Got very minimal work in the receiving game because he didn't really have to get utilized in that regard, and we don't expect him to this week. Either way, he's my number 1. Moving on, we have Austin Ekeler as our number 2 running back on the week, taking on the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, like we all experienced last season, this is a matchup we always want to play our running backs against. And based on what they've gone ahead and done through free agency, bringing in players, they really haven't made that big of a difference in order to make me, fear the matchup in any regard. In fact, I'm excited about it, and that's why I have Austin Ekeler in this number 2 position. Last season, when the Los Angeles Chargers took on the Las Vegas Raiders, Austin Ekeler was incredible. In the 2 performances, week 4 and 18, he put up 26.5 in one game and 23.9 fantasy points in the other. 31 attempts for 181 rushing yards, a 5.84 yard per carry average. Of course, was able to get himself 8 catches, 2 receiving touchdowns, 2 rushing touchdowns. Again, over 50 points in 2 contests, a 25.2 fantasy point per game average against that defense. We're all expecting a lot of success out of Austin Ekeler this week. That's why I have him as my number 2. All right, let's talk about Christian McCaffrey as our number 3 this week. Now, this shouldn't be very difficult. Christian McCaffrey is fully healthy, and he's going to be on the field at that capacity, dominating whatever defense you put in front of him. I don't care about the matchup. Even though Cleveland has shown to be a better defense over the last couple years, it's still a neutral matchup in my opinion, and it's not scaring me in the idea of playing Christian McCaffrey against them. Now, if we talk about Christian McCaffrey at a healthy rate, in the last 2 seasons, in the 8 full healthy games that he has played, he has put up consistent fantasy numbers. In fact, in 7 of those 8 games, he put up 21 plus fantasy points. Those 7 performances were all top 6 running back standings within their given week. Of course, they're going to continue to utilize him in the receiving game. And when you go ahead and look at Baker Mayfield's stats as a quarterback, prior to Kevin Stefanski joining the Cleveland Browns in 2020-2021, when you look at Baker's first 2 years as the Cleveland Browns quarterback, overall, his targets per game to his respective running backs consisted of 7.17. That led to 5.6 receptions, 47.1 receiving yards, and 0.2 receiving touchdowns per game. If you go ahead and just elevate those numbers just slightly, get those 9 targets in the direction of Christian McCaffrey, of course, those are numbers that we're relatively comfortable seeing in regards to a Christian McCaffrey scoreline. Obviously, it's not going to be that case every single week, but when you're talking about a Cleveland Browns defense that may have a little bit of a better run-stopping defense than normal teams, I think at this current moment in time, McCaffrey's certainly going to get his utilization in the receiving game and have another 21-plus point fantasy performance in week 1 of the 2022 season. All right, let's talk about Derrick Henry. Again, he plays against the New York Giants. The New York Giants last season, like it says on screen, on a per-week basis, were giving up 15.87 fantasy points per game just on rushing statistics alone. That gives me that much more confidence in Derrick Henry. But some of the other stats that we got to mention. Last season, weeks 1 through 8, the guy was averaging 23.04 fantasy points per game, 117 rushing yards per game on 27.4 rushing attempts per game. That level of opportunity is obviously going to lead to success in fantasy football, regardless of who the running back is. So now that you have an opportunity at Derrick Henry dominating a potential New York Giants defense, I understand their interior defensive line has improved, but it certainly isn't going to play that big of a factor this upcoming week. You got to just take some things into perspective. Last year, even when Derrick Henry was out of the lineup, the Tennessee Titans were a run-first team, and they succeeded in that. From weeks 11 through 18, they were still averaging 21.94 fantasy points per game from their running backs as an entire backfield. That's a lot of opportunity leading to a lot of success which really isn't a surprise. The last stat that I wanted to mention before we move on from Derrick Henry is the fact that in 6 out of his last 18 games, he has put up 30 or more fantasy points. I mean, the fact that 33% of the time, or you have a 33% chance of him putting up 30 points in a given week as of the last 18 games, I mean, that just kind of speaks to how incredible he has been as of late. Moving on, let's talk about the thumbnail of today's video. Dalvin Cook, running back of the Minnesota Vikings. They take on the Green Bay Packers. Another one of these advantageous matchups, in my opinion, mainly because the Minnesota Vikings have had the Green Bay Packers number over the last couple years. Now, if you go ahead and look at last year's statistics, when you have Dalvin Cook taking on the Green Bay Packers in week 11 with Kirk Cousins under center, he scored 21 fantasy points, had a great game. Now, the other game later on in the season, week 17, did not consist of Kirk Cousins under center. He was out for that game, so it purely just doesn't matter. But when you go ahead and isolate the games in which Kirk Cousins has been under center since 2019, and Dalvin Cook has taken on the Green Bay Packers, he's averaged 23.3 fantasy points per game against them. In those 4 games that he's played since 2019 against the Packers, he has scored a total of 8 touchdowns. Again, a lot of production has been found, and he's been quite successful against that defense. Now you go ahead and revitalize this offense with Kevin O'Connell, the new head coach, offensive-minded from the Los Angeles Rams coming in. This matchup typically leads to a lot of points being scored, so I'm excited about whether it goes through the running game or in the passing game. We know Dalvin Cook is going to be involved. Moving on, let's talk about Joe Mixon, our number 6. Joe Mixon takes on the Pittsburgh Steelers, and though the Pittsburgh Steelers were awful last season, I mean, again, they were giving up the 5th most points to opposing running backs in rushing statistics alone, 16.65 per game. Obviously, Joe Mixon took advantage of that himself last season. In the 2 games that he played against the Pittsburgh Steelers last year, in one of the contests, he had 9.9 fantasy points, and in the other, he had 30.3. In that 30.3 fantasy point game, the Cincinnati Bengals won 41-10. In the 2 games that they took on the Pittsburgh Steelers last year, they scored a total of 65 offensive points. That in itself kind of gives you an indication as to where exactly we're going to see this offense and where we're going to see Joe Mixon at the end of week 1. Let's not forget, besides the success he found against that defense, averaging 5.54 yards per carry on average last year against them, he also has 4 new starting offensive linemen. From left guard to right tackle, you got brand new starters. And if in fact we're in a situation where the Pittsburgh Steelers have not improved their run-stopping ability this offseason, we could very easily see another 20-point performance from Joe Mixon this upcoming week as the Cincinnati Bengals will be tearing through that Pittsburgh Steelers front. All right, let's talk about Alvin Kamara taking on the Atlanta Falcons, a division rival. We've seen him play against this team twice a year for his entire career. And of course, he's found a lot of success. Now, first and foremost, when we go into week 1, the thing that I wanted to note, the left tackle, the first-round pick for the New Orleans Saints, Trevor Penning, he has been placed on the injured reserve. They have a backup left tackle. Again, last season with Terron Armstead, they had a backup left tackle almost the whole year because he was, pretty much banged up the entire season. So they're used to having a rotation at the offensive line. I don't think that's going to play a big factor, especially considering the matchup on hand. Now, let's not forget, last season between weeks 1 through 7 with Jameis Winston under center, Alvin Kamara was averaging 18.08 fantasy points per game. On top of it, averaging himself over 4 catches per game and over 5.5 targets per game. Great numbers. We love to see it. Hopefully that's just going to continue because in the 2 games that he took on the Atlanta Falcons last year, weeks 9 and 18, he put up 18.4 and 17.2 total fantasy points. In fact, in that second game against the Atlanta Falcons, he had 30 rushing attempts. So he ended up having 43 rushing attempts against them as a whole last season for 196 yards, a 4.56 yard per carry average. Still got himself a lot of receiving work, 6 catches for 70 yards, and was averaging 17.8 fantasy points per game and a half PPR against that team. In my opinion, it's going to be more of the same. In fact, it may even be easier considering you have Michael Thomas, Jarvis Landry, Jameis Winston, Chris Olave. You have a far more capable offense that is only going to cause more and more problems for that Falcons defense, which of course, Alvin Kamara is going to be able to take advantage of. Moving on, let's talk about Nick Chubb. All right, so Nick Chubb is in a position where he takes on the Carolina Panthers. Carolina Panthers, in terms of how many yards and how many points they gave up to opposing running backs last season in terms of rushing stats alone, they were in the middle of the pack. I think this is a relatively advantageous matchup because we know the amount of talent that Nick Chubb has and how well his offensive line has played when they're fully healthy. Again, you have 2 of the best offensive guards, probably top 3, both of them, Joel Petonio and Wyatt Teller. You have Jedrick Wills, the left tackle, back and healthy, and also Jack Conklin, who's going to make a huge difference as their starting right tackle, back and healthy. Obviously was dealing with that elbow injury last season. Now that you have that entire group back, you're in a position to find a lot of success, especially considering when Jacoby Brissett is under center, they're going to have to run the ball. And last year, when we saw Case Keenum or Nick Mullins under center for the Cleveland Browns, when Baker Mayfield was out with an injury, they ran the ball through their running backs 28.33 times per game in the 3 games in which they had to do so. So I expect a lot of running from Nick Chubb and a lot of opportunity for him to get the ball down on the goal line and, of course, punch it in and find himself scoring some touchdowns. Let's not forget last season, weeks 1 through 5, when Kareem Hunt was active. Nick Chubb was still averaging 16.06 fantasy points per game, was the number 8 overall running back throughout that span of time, having 19 touches per game. Those are numbers that I'm expecting to see this week against the Carolina Panthers. I know it's going to be a little bit of a rivalry game. Baker's trying to get his revenge game against his former team, but Nick Chubb is going to have a lot to say about that. Moving on, let's talk about Aaron Jones, our number 9 running back, taking on the Minnesota Vikings. Again, in the same vein in which Dalvin Cook has found a lot of success against the Green Bay Packers, we can say the same thing about Aaron Jones against the Minnesota Vikings. The Minnesota Vikings matchup has been quite easy for this team in the last couple of years, especially on the ground. Just looking at how many points Minnesota gave up last year to opposing running backs in terms of rushing statistics alone, 14.54 is a lot. Now, last season, in the one game that Aaron Jones had an opportunity of taking on the Minnesota Vikings, he was at a limited capacity. Again, he barely was even on the field because he was still dealing with that knee injury, yet he had himself 8 rushing attempts for 76 yards. That's a 9.5 yard per carry average, 5 catches on 6 targets for 30 receiving yards, 13.1 fantasy points without even scoring a touchdown. That in itself gives me confidence, because when you go back to weeks 1 through 9 of last year and compare it to weeks 10 through 17, there is a huge difference. In fact, in the beginning of the season, prior to his injury, weeks 1 through 9, he was playing 65% of the offensive snaps, and then it went to playing 49% at the back end of the year. Let's not forget about the player that we're talking about here. Aaron Jones is an extremely talented, dynamic running back. He scored 40 touchdowns in his last 45 games. When Davante Adams has not been in this lineup, he's averaged over 25 half PPR fantasy points per game. If we're going to see more of that, why not against the Minnesota Vikings? They're going to have to run the ball. That's going to be their main offensive threat this upcoming week. I expect them to find success. Of course, Aaron Jones should be started. We're starting our studs. Moving on, let's talk about Najee Harris. Najee Harris takes on the Cincinnati Bengals. He had 2 games against them last year, 1 successful, 1 not so much. The only successful game he found against them was when he was going on a absolute tear in terms of receptions. 19 targets led to 14 receptions. That game in itself was an anomaly. Now, the following game, again, the entire offense didn't find much success. They got blown out 41-10. That game was just not even fun at any capacity. But overall, when I went ahead and looked at the statistics that Najee Harris had last season, 22 rushing attempts for 63 rushing yards against his team, a 2.86 yard per carry average. That does not seem like Najee Harris-esque numbers. 22 rushing attempts should be just in one singular game, much less 2 combined. I expect this team to get back to running the ball with an improved offensive line. I know there's a lot of question marks surrounding Mitchell Trubisky and his ability to come in and make immediate plays, but I think this is an advantage for the team. The Cincinnati Bengals don't know what to expect. They could come out with a completely different looking offense with Matt Canada bringing in some RPO options for Mitchell Trubisky to be a more mobile option in this backfield in comparison to what Ben Roethlisberger was presenting in seasons past. I think there's a lot of potential. When you look at the run-stopping ability of the Cincinnati Bengals, they've got a good interior defensive line. Outside of that, unless they're playing playoff football like the way that they looked just a couple months ago, I still think that Najee Harris is going to find a success because the opportunity is certainly going to be there. Moving on, let's talk about Leonard Fournette taking on the Dallas Cowboys. Now, he had an opportunity of playing this team last year. In week 1's contest against them, he only totaled for 8.4 fantasy points. But at this current moment in time, they were still giving Ronald Jones opportunity at a higher rate. Again, in that contest, Leonard Fournette played 60% of the offensive snaps and had 14 touches. I thought that was enough to get the job done. Obviously, he wasn't able to accompany that performance with a touchdown, which definitely was disappointing. Nonetheless, just a couple weeks later, they finally gave Leonard Fournette the full reign of the backfield, in which from weeks 4 through 14, the man was absolutely on a tear in the National Football League, averaging 18.8 half PPR fantasy points per game. In the last 12 games that we saw Leonard Fournette play last season, even including the game he got injured and in the NFL playoffs, this man had 79 total targets for 66 receptions, 433 receiving yards. That's 5.5 receptions per game in the last 12 games that we've seen him in. I understand that this team wants to go ahead and potentially limit his utilization, but Tom Brady just loves to throw this man the ball. And as long as that's going to continue to be an option, his fantasy stock's going to continue to rise. And I know that Dallas played well in terms of stopping the run last season, but when we're talking about a guy that has the receiving threat of getting 5 or more receptions in any given game, that opportunity just continues to rise his overall fantasy upside, which makes him a top 12 standing. Let's talk about the final of our top 12, the RB1s of this week. We have James Conner closing us out, taking on the Kansas City Chiefs. I think it's a relatively advantageous matchup. When I look at the matchup as a whole, I don't see the run stopping of the Kansas City Chiefs completely nullifying everything that James Conner can do, because what James Conner is going to be asked to do this upcoming season, that he was only asked to do 6 times last year, is to be a 3-down back. Again, last year, without Chase Edmonds in the lineup, he was playing 81% of the snaps, was averaging 5 receptions per game, and over 23 fantasy points per game. If he gets back into that kind of streak of having incredible performances in which he's touching the ball over 20 times per game, of course, I mean, we're going to find success. James Conner's far too talented, and it's in an offense that obviously continues to give him the ball down on the goal line. He had the 3rd most red zone rushing attempts amongst all running backs last season in the National Football League, which led to double-digit touchdowns. He'll have the ability to run the ball in early downs. He's going to have the goal line work. He's going to get the receptions. It's just a matter of how big of a shootout we end up seeing between Kansas City and the Arizona Cardinals that potentially lifts his overall upside through that ceiling. Moving on. Let's talk about our number 13, DeAndre Swift, takes on the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, last year they took on the Philadelphia Eagles in Week 8, and it was a quite unforgiving matchup. You know, DeAndre Swift did not find much success against that team. Again, we know that the Philadelphia Eagles, when healthy, are a pretty good defense, especially their defensive line. If you have Brandon Graham out there, Fletcher Cox, they're going to find a lot of success, especially rushing the passer. I mean, last season, the reason why the Detroit Lions heavily struggled in that game is because Jared Goff was in shambles. The guy was sacked 6 times throughout that entire contest, and that defensive line as a whole had so many tackles for loss. The offensive line was injured. There were a lot of struggles across the board, and there's a reason why. DeAndre Swift only had 3.1 fantasy points against them. Now, we're going to get a completely different conversation going into week 1 of the 2022 season. You have a fully healthy offensive line. If they're able to protect Jared Goff, you're going to get yourself in a far more advantageous position because he'll be able to check down the ball to DeAndre Swift on those swing passes, in those screen plays, because that's exactly how they want to get the ball out of his hands quickly so that the pass rush is not getting into his face and pretty much just scaring him for the whole game, because we've seen it back in the days when he was a Los Angeles Ram. Anytime you send heavy pressure at Jared Goff, he begins to crumble. So hopefully we'll be able to, mitigate that with a good pass protection overall because you have a healthy offensive line. Now, after the fact that we saw this game in week 8 of the 2021 season, there was a bit of an offensive coaching change. Anthony Lynn was asked to no longer play call for the remainder of the season, and Dan Campbell went ahead and did so. The following 2 games that the Detroit Lions had after this Philadelphia Eagles matchup, I mean, they went off. In fact, in those 2 games, DeAndre Swift had 130 rushing yards in each of them, compared to against the Philadelphia Eagles, 12 carries for 27 yards, a big difference maker. If they continue to lean towards heavily running the ball, getting him, opportunities out of the backfield as a receiving threat, of course, a top 13 standing is a bare minimum for DeAndre Swift. Moving on to Javonte Williams. Again, Javonte Williams takes on the Seattle Seahawks. This is going to be a revenge game for Russell Wilson. I mean, it purely is. And even though there may not be as much animosity between Tom Brady and Bill Belichick like we saw this last season, and maybe as much as we saw from Matthew Stafford taking on the Detroit Lions last season, what the common thread between those 2 games was the quarterbacks were really slow to start. And we may see that from Russell Wilson going back to Seattle. There's going to be a lot of emotions in that arena. So if in fact they lean upon the running game, which I expect them to do with Javonte Williams being their guy, quote unquote, this is going to be an opportunity for him to show everyone that he is a potential RB1 going into the 2022 season. Again, with Melvin Gordon in the lineup last year, he was averaging 9.79 fantasy points per game. If we take that as a bare minimum, even if they split touches overall, we're going to get a lot more upside from Javonte, especially if this team scores touchdowns in bunches. Because if Russell Wilson is able to drive them down the field and find a lot of success in Seattle, Javonte Williams should be set up for a lot of receiving work, some goal line opportunities, and scoring some fantasy points. Moving on, let's talk about Saquon Barkley. So we've gone ahead and we've entered in our first warning. I need to warn you guys based on the matchup as the New York Giants take on the Tennessee Titans. The Tennessee Titans were one of the better run-stopping defenses last season, and they've really just kept their same defense. Their defensive line is just as good as it's ever been, and they're going to continue to utilize that threat to just keep quarterbacks under pressure the entire game and stop the run. I mean, that's what they did last year. They didn't even give up 10 points per game to opposing running backs on average in a half PPR scoring from rushing statistics alone. They played extremely well last season, which gives me a little bit of worry for Saquon Barkley. But that being said, when we think about what Saquon has, he has a brand new offensive line, a new center, right guard, right tackle. Again, they spent a first-round pick for Evan Neal out of Alabama to be their right tackle. They brought in a guard from the Indianapolis Colts, great at run blocking, to play the right guard position. Andrew Thomas is going to be great as their left tackle. Across the board, they've improved offensive line-wise. But it's a matter of whether or not they're going to be able to compete with just as good of a defensive line in Tennessee. Now, if in fact we get into a situation where the running game does fall apart, we're going to have to see Daniel Jones utilize the passing game, especially giving Saquon Barkley more opportunity as a receiving option. In the 37 full healthy games we have seen Daniel Jones played, he has targeted his running backs 5.76 times per game. That has led to 4.2 receptions per game, 32 receiving yards per game. That in itself is not high enough, in my opinion. If we're going to get Saquon Barkley more utilization, if this running game falls apart, which hopefully it won't because this offensive line is on the right track, I'm just throwing out a warning. The matchup is difficult, but I trust the skill of Saquon Barkley and the opportunity that he's going to be given as the solo lone back of this Giants offense to get the job done. Moving on, let's talk about our number 16, Josh Jacobs, taking on the Los Angeles Chargers. So here's the deal with the Chargers defense. Last season, they were awful. Obviously, they've made incredible improvements, but I don't think that's going to be, making that big of a difference. In terms of the additions that they've made in terms of their front seven, Kyle Van Noy, Khalil Mack, Sebastian Joseph Day, they've brought in some pieces here and there. They still have Bosa on the other side of the a defensive line, but ultimately, is this enough to make that big of a difference in terms of stopping the run? They were giving up 18.41 fantasy points per game in rushing statistics alone per game last season. Yet with all that said, I don't really think this is going to be, a complete 180 shift. They're going to still struggle in terms of stopping the run, especially once they have to cover Devontae Adams, Hunter Renfrow, and Darren Waller on the field. They cannot stack the box. So when given the opportunity, Josh Jacobs is going to be able to potentially develop here and put up great fantasy points. Last season, in the two contests that he took on the Los Angeles Chargers, 8.2 fantasy points, 21.4. In the first game where he only scored 8.2 fantasy points, the Las Vegas Raiders did not have a first down in the entire first quarter. They were playing a game script in which they had to continue to pass the ball, and there's a reason why. Josh Jacobs had a lot of receptions in that game, and so did Kenyon Drake. So if in fact we're in a scenario similar to that Week 18 contest where this is a shootout, we're going to see a lot of success from both sides, and especially from the running game. If you can't stack the box against the Raiders, they're going to heavily run the ball. That is what Josh McDaniels does and what he has shown to do with the Patriots in seasons past. We'll see that this week from the Raiders. Moving on to our number 17, Antonio Gibson. Listen, with Brian Robinson on the injured reserve, Antonio Gibson has an opportunity to claim this position and maybe hold on to his starting standing for the rest of the year based on how he produces in the next coming weeks. Now, he takes on the Jacksonville Jaguars. That is one of the easiest matchups that you can possibly ask for. Over the last 3+ years, that has been, a matchup that we salivate for our respective running backs. Now, the significant offensive line versus defensive line advantage that the Washington Commanders have this week is pretty ridiculous. I think it's one of the best on the given week. The Jacksonville Jaguars are going to have their hands full in terms of stopping the run, as the Washington Commanders have one of the best run blocking offensive lines in the National Football League. I'd say they're probably top 8 in that category. Now, when I went ahead and looked at how well Antonio Gibson produced last season with J.D. McKissic in the lineup, he was still averaging 12.32 fantasy points per game from weeks 1 through 12, averaging 16.64 attempts per game, 2.36 receptions per game, so 19 touches per game were automatic on average for Antonio Gibson. As long as this man does not fumble, he is going to stay out on the field, and he's still going to get receiving work. When you go ahead and compare his overall production from weeks 1 through 12, and then 13 through 18 when J.D. McKissic was out of the lineup, the only difference maker is total touchdowns. That's literally it. Outside of that, we saw identical opportunity and production on the ground and through the air in terms of receiving and rushing yards. That in itself gives me confidence to trot Antonio Gibson out there as an RB2 this week in a fantastic matchup. Moving on to our number 18, Elijah Mitchell. They take on the Chicago Bears. Now, last season, they had an opportunity to take on the Chicago Bears, and they absolutely dominated. I mean, Elijah Mitchell himself had 19.7 fantasy points, and he literally didn't have any work in the receiving game. 137 rushing yards on 18 attempts. That's a 7.6 yard per carry average against that defense. And when I went ahead and graded out the defenses based on their current players and how they produced last season, the Chicago Bears have one of the worst defenses in terms of stopping the run going into the 2022 year. Overall, this seems like a perfect opportunity for the 49ers to start with the victory in week 1. Besides the fact that we saw a lot of success from Elijah Mitchell, a couple of the contributing factors was because there was no Debo running the ball and Jimmy Garoppolo was a starting quarterback. Now you have Debo back, could be utilized in that rushing role a little bit, not all the time, and you still have Trey Lance, who is going to go ahead and scramble and get yardage. With that all being considered, I think this is far too vital of a matchup to not start Elijah Mitchell. He's one of our stud running backs, and we drafted him to play. Therefore, we're starting him as our number 18. Moving on, we have Miles Sanders, another extremely advantageous matchup. Over the last 3 years, we have seen a common trend of the Detroit Lions not being able to stop the run. So regardless of what running back is lining up for the Philadelphia Eagles, they're going to find success. I mean, last season, they took on the Detroit Lions, and they dominated in the running game with their two primary backs being Jordan Howard and Boston Scott. In fact, Jordan Howard and Boston Scott both scored individually more than 17 fantasy points in that game. As a whole, the running attack for the Philadelphia Eagles from their running backs combined for 37 rushing attempts, 144 rushing yards, 4 rushing touchdowns, and 38.4 total fantasy points. They're going to run through the Detroit Lions defense. And I know when we look at the entire offensive line for the Philadelphia Eagles, in my opinion, this is the best offensive line in terms of run blocking in the league. And when you have an opportunity to take on one of the worst run-stopping defenses in the league, this is a pretty advantageous matchup that we have to utilize Miles Sanders in. Last season, he didn't score a single touchdown. I'm putting it out there. I think Miles Sanders scores a touchdown in this game and puts the past behind him and continues to start the 2022 season, on the right track. Moving on, let's talk about Damien Harris taking on the Miami Dolphins. Listen, the Miami Dolphins front are really talented, but so is the run blocking threat of the New England Patriots. They've got a fantastic offensive line up front, and they're going to continue to utilize that as one of their main advantages. Now, you're going down to Miami in September. That weather advantage that the Miami players are going to have is pretty significant because it's going to be hot and humid down there, and it's not going to be comfortable. But nonetheless, running the ball is going to be a vital part of this offense. In the 2 games that the New England Patriots took on the Miami Dolphins last year, Damien Harris had 10.7 points and 15.3 points. A total of 34 rushing attempts for 137 rushing yards, a 4.03 yard per carry average, was able to get himself some work in the receiving game, 13 fantasy points per game if you go ahead and average it out in those 2 contests. In my opinion, yes, it's a little bit of a tougher matchup, but I really do think that this is a opportunity for Damien Harris to continue to find success as the primary back of this team. They're going to have to run the ball. And, unless he's out with an injury, he is that number 1 back. That's why we've drafted him as such. And he's an absolute start for week 1. Moving on, let's talk about David Montgomery against the 49ers. Now, I thought about making this a warning matchup because the 49ers have played well against opposing running backs, but ultimately they still given up a fair amount of points on the ground to opposing running backs, 13.26 last season. Now, obviously, if they go ahead and make some, incredible improvements, you're going to find some success there. But the primary reason they may find immediate success is because of how bad the run blocking is for the Chicago Bears. Now, last season, they had an opportunity of playing each other. Khalil Herbert had 23 rushing attempts for 72 yards. A decent game. Got himself a total of 7.8 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. We'll take those numbers out of Khalil Herbert, but what is David Montgomery capable of doing? Of course, he's a receiving threat. In the last 2 games that he played with Justin Fields last season, he had 13 targets, 11 catches, and 62 receiving yards. If that's going to continue to be an active part of this offense, then David Montgomery's floor continues to rise going into week 1. Of course, Justin Fields is going to be running for his life, quite literally, honestly, because last time he took on the 49ers, he had 100 rushing yards and 10 rushing attempts and a rushing touchdown. So besides the fact that he's going to be actively running the ball in order to gain yardage, he's going to be running away from Nick Bosa for the majority of this game and looking for the check down option, which is going to be David Montgomery. They're certainly going to run the ball in order to set some tempo, but ultimately, the amount of opportunity that David Montgomery is going to be given is the biggest difference maker in terms of his overall success this week and in comparison to other running backs. Moving on to A.J. Dillon. All right, he takes on the Minnesota Vikings. Last year, he had 2 opportunities of doing so, and he was quite successful. Now, in those 2 contests, weeks 11 and 17, he put up 9.7 fantasy points and 20.3 fantasy points. A total of 25 carries for 116 rushing yards, a 4.64 yard per carry average, 2 rushing touchdowns, pretty much averaged 15 points per game against the Minnesota Vikings last year. In fact, in the solo game, he was far less effective than when he had Aaron Jones on the field, where he had a 20-point monster performance. All we've heard this offseason from Matt LaFleur is that he believes there are 2 1A running backs in this backfield. If that's going to be the case, I believe him. And we could very easily see Aaron Jones go for 15 fantasy points and A.J. Dillon settle for 11 or 12 this upcoming week. If he accompanies that with a touchdown, I'm kind of assuming the touchdown's already incorporated there. But if a touchdown and more upside is along with it, of course, that's why he's an automatic start. Moving on to Chase Edmonds on number 23, taking on the New England Patriots. Now, though Chase Edmonds personally hasn't found success with the Dolphins yet, again, he was just signed this offseason. When you look at running backs for the Miami Dolphins last year and how well they performed against the New England Patriots, you can bet that the Miami Dolphins this offseason have watched that film and are going to continue to abuse the advantages that they had last season, regardless of the fact that there is a completely different regime and coaching staff. Last year, in the 2 games that the New England Patriots took on the Miami Dolphins, Miami accumulated for 54 running back rushing attempts, 225 rushing yards, a 4.17 yard per carry average, 11 receptions on 12 targets, 67 receiving yards, and 40.7 fantasy points. A total of 20 fantasy points per game on average from Miami running backs against the New England Patriots. That in itself gives me a lot of hope for what exactly Chase Edmonds is potentially capable of this upcoming week. Of course, you see on the bottom of the screen how many points in those 2 individual games, 15 and 25. In that 25-point game, Duke Johnson took over. If Duke Johnson in week 18 of a season is able to just do those kind of numbers, imagine what Chase Edmonds is capable of. All right, moving on. Let's talk about Cam Akers. I'm a little bit weary about what his potential is this week. Ultimately, he is still coming off of an injury where he sustained at training camp. It was a soft tissue injury, and so is Darrell Henderson. So both these guys, they're not trying to rush them back, but they're trying to make sure that they're prepared for Thursday night. And if that is going to be the case, we may be in a position where we get split carries or touches or snaps overall. And if that's going to be the case, then Cam Akers is going to be a far less vital option. But if in fact you're trying to find success against the Buffalo Bills, and I'm sure Sean McVay has already gone ahead and keyed in on this, the number one way to do so is to run the ball down the middle. Literally run it up the gut, because this defense is not built for that. They are a coverage team. There's a reason why they allowed the fewest points to opposing wide receivers last season in a half PPR scoring format, and there's a reason why they were in the middle of the pack in terms of giving up points to running backs, because they cannot stop the run. They are not equipped to do so. They're a coverage team. And if you're going to abuse them up the middle by running the ball, by all means, Cam Akers should find success. I'm just hoping they continue to utilize him and they don't split his touches. We know he's going to be the primary goal line back. Hopefully they use him as such. Moving on, let's talk about Travis Etienne. So we once again present another warning sign. As of right now, I'm a little worried based on the matchup and for other reasons, but specifically via the matchup, this is an offensive line for the Jaguars who really is unproven. They have a couple pieces there that are pretty decent. One specifically being Brandon Sheriff that they brought in from the Washington Commanders, a former All-Pro guard. But outside of that, this is not a great offensive line, and you're playing against a defensive line that was really good in terms of stopping the run last year, only giving up 10.6 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs in terms of rushing stats. So if, in fact, we're taking into consideration the offensive line is going to struggle at times, and we're also taking into account that James Robinson might be returning this week, we may get split touches in this backfield. And if that's going to be the case, that keeps me a little bit, precautious when it comes to playing Travis Etienne in all capacities. Obviously, we want to start our studs. And I believe at the number 25 ranking, he is probably still your stud. But I'm putting it out there. It's a warning. He needs to get a lot of receiving work in order to be a relevant option in this given week if James Robinson is back. Because if, in fact, James Robinson gets any of those goal line opportunities and ends up vulturing a touchdown here or there, we could be in a little bit of trouble. We'll see what exactly the current status is of James Robinson as we progress through the week. But for right now, again, ranking subject to change, we're keeping it as such. Moving on, Kareem Hunt taking on the Carolina Panthers. Now, I've already gone ahead and mentioned this in regards to Nick Chubb earlier this video, but I'll mention it again. Last season, in the 3 games in which a backup quarterback played for the Cleveland Browns and started, Case Keenum in 2 of them and Nick Mullins in 1 of them, they ran the ball with their running backs 28.33 times per game. So we're going to see a lot of opportunity in terms of running the ball this upcoming week for this offense. And of course, if you look at the averages in which, touches per game that Nick Chubb had weeks 1 through 5 last year and Kareem Hunt last season prior to Kareem Hunt going down with an injury, of course, we saw Nick Chubb averaging 19 touches per game and Kareem Hunt 14.4. Now, throughout that time, Kareem Hunt was the better overall fantasy running back, averaging 16.98 fantasy points per game and was the number 5 overall back throughout that span of time, weeks 1 through 5. So I expect to see a lot of success out of this backfield. Whether or not he is vulturing touchdowns, he's going to get a lot of opportunity in terms of rushing attempts, and that in itself keeps him as a valuable prospect in a pretty decent matchup. Moving on, let's talk about Rashaad Penny. All right, Penny is another one of these players that I want to throw out a warning for, because when you have Geno Smith as your starting quarterback, it is going to be pretty easy for a defense to say, hey, Geno, we want you to beat us. Throw the ball, we're going to stop the run, and we're going to force you to beat us on a downly basis. And if that's going to be the case, Rashaad Penny could be in trouble because they could definitely stack the box. Hopefully, DK Metcalf, Noah Fant, and Tyler Lockett are able to help spread this defense out and give Rashaad Penny more opportunities against, lighter stacked boxes. But ultimately, what we saw last year from Rashaad Penny, weeks 14 through 18, gives us some semblance of confidence. The fact that he was averaging over 21 fantasy points per game, and now he begins the year without Kenneth Walker active, we're probably going to be in a position where Rashaad Penny is getting a lot of opportunities, a lot of touches overall. And the more touches you get with Walker out, I mean, the more chances he has of being the red zone threat, getting receiving work, and potentially breaking out a huge run. Again, last season, he led all running backs in the National Football League in yards per carry, and he led all running backs with a minimum of 100 rushing attempts in yards per carry after contact. There is a lot of hope for Rashaad Penny. The matchup is difficult, but I'm just warning you. I'm not telling you to avoid him. Moving on. Let's talk about Ezekiel Elliott. Now, this one is a little bit tricky. Zeke took on Tampa Bay last year. He put up 4.9 fantasy points in week 1 against that matchup. Tampa Bay is known for being one of the best, run-stopping defenses in the league. They've gone ahead and only gotten better this offseason as a front. That worries me, a lot. And there's a reason why I have Ezekiel Elliott all the way down here. Though we do say start our studs, let's just be real. Unless Ezekiel Elliott is getting a bunch of receiving work or falling into the end zone, the chances are he's not going to find much success, considering the offensive line issues they have and how well Tampa Bay has played in the last couple years. Now, ultimately, Zeke last season, 11 rushing attempts for 33 rushing yards, 2 catches on 2 targets for 6 receiving yards. Not a great week 1 outing for him last year, but I'm thinking it's going to be more of the same. That is what concerns me. I'm just throwing it out there. It's a bad matchup. They've got a pretty beat up offensive line with Tyler Smith, their left guard rookie. Him also dealing with a little bit of an injury, besides the fact that Tyron Smith is out until December, maybe out for the entire year. That worries me. They're going to be throwing the ball a lot for sure, but I don't know if they're going to be running and giving Zeke all that opportunity that he certainly needs to be a fantasy value. Moving on to Dameon Pierce. All right, he takes on the Indianapolis Colts. This is one of the tougher matchups as well on top of it. Again, when you go ahead and look at what the Colts were doing to opposing offenses last year, and the fact that I've already mentioned this offseason, the Texans have one of the worst offensive lines in the league, that just leads me to believe that we're going to be in a little bit of trouble. In the 2 games that the Houston Texans took on the Colts last season, they were blown out 62-3 in terms of total points scored. That in itself is very worrisome. But if we're going to see Dameon Pierce utilized in the receiving game with Davis Mills, then by all means, we're going to have a lot of opportunity to get a lot of garbage time points within this offense. But if in fact the Colts come out, they run the ball, they kill the clock, they milk the clock, and the time expires before Dameon Pierce is able to really get anything going, I wouldn't be surprised. That being said, I still think he's a top 30 option because he's the starting running back of his team, and the opportunity is certainly going to be there. All right, let's move on to J.K. Dobbins. Many of you may have been wondering, where is J.K. Dobbins already, Andrew? The issue with J.K. Dobbins right now is the fact that I don't know if he's even going to play. If I don't know if a running back is going to be active in week 1, I can't rank them relatively high. Now, of course, we have rankings subject to change, and we're going to go ahead and change these by Sunday mornings during our live stream, and I'll be showing you guys the rankings updated. But as of right now, yes, it's an incredible matchup. The Jets have been the worst run-stopping defense for the last 5 years. But it doesn't change the fact that we don't know if J.K. Dobbins is going to be at a full capacity, much less even playing. There's a reason why they signed Mike Davis and Kenyon Drake this offseason. So if in fact we're in a scenario where he is active, but he is still limited, even the matchup itself may not be enough. But hey, we're throwing it out there. He's going to sit at our number 30 option. If he gets himself a full week of practice with no hesitation, no film of him limping at practice, nothing like that. If we get a full consistent week out of J.K. Dobbins, he's going to fly up the board. He has very easy top 10 upside against the Jets defense, especially considering how effective the Baltimore Ravens running game has been in the last couple years. Moving on, let's talk about our number 31, Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Listen, Clyde Edwards is in a decent matchup. I don't mind it at all. My only issue is that there is a committee situation building here with Jerick McKinnon and Isaiah Pacheco, and that in itself is extremely worrisome because if in fact we already know that Clyde Edwards is not going to be the goal line back of this team, sure, he's going to get his opportunity, but if you're not going to get those potential upside points from touchdowns, that is something that it just scares me. And it makes it that much more difficult to play this prospect. But yet, he is still going to be the starter for his team. In the last 2 years, anytime he has had 13 or more opportunities in a game, he's averaged 11.88 fantasy points per game. He's done that 16 times. That in itself gives me some semblance of confidence to get him out there, potentially have him as my flex option against the Arizona Cardinals in a matchup that should be a shootout. But what we've seen over the last couple of years is that Patrick Mahomes very rarely will heavily implement a running back in the receiving game. Darrell Williams certainly was able to have himself great games last year, but with so much of a rotation now, with Jerick McKinnon just as capable and Isaiah in the same capacity, I think Clyde Edwards-Helaire is just that much less of a valuable option. That's why he sits at 31. Moving on, let's talk about another committee situation that I think is building. Besides the fact that the Buffalo Bills take on one of the better run-stopping defenses in the Los Angeles Rams in LA this upcoming Thursday, I'm a little bit worried about what kind of utilization we're going to see out of Devin Singletary. We still have Zach Moss and James Cook in this offense. And yes, James Cook is going to be the receiving threat. Okay, if you're going to remove that receiving work that Devin Singletary was certainly banking on, that's going to lower his overall upside. If he's not going to have the opportunity to run the ball as much because this matchup is going to lend to passing even more, then, what can we potentially expect? I know last season from weeks 14 through the NFL playoffs, this was a guy that was averaging 18 fantasy points per game, playing 84% of the offensive snaps. But if they transition away from that and split him back down to playing 50% of the snaps, maybe 45%, we may be in a scenario where we just can't trust Devin Singletary. This is kind of a wait and see kind of project. As of right now, I trust him at a capacity of being a flex option if that's my best available player. But even in that regard, the fact that James Cook could take away receiving work and Josh Allen could take away those rushing touchdowns does scare me. Moving on, Breece Hall on number 33. I think this pretty much counts for both Breece Hall and Michael Carter. I mean, they're going to split touches, but ultimately we gotta roll out our studs. We invested in Breece Hall to make some plays, and hopefully he's going to get the job done. Now, this is going to be a little bit of a revenge game, Joe Flacco versus his former team, the Baltimore Ravens, and it's going to be exciting because Joe Flacco loves to throw the ball to his running backs. We've seen it in the past with Danny Woodhead. We've seen it with Kyle Juszczyk back in the days with the Baltimore Ravens. We've seen it recently, even last year with the Jets. He likes to target his running backs. And if that's going to be the case, both Breece Hall and Michael Carter are both capable receiving threats. I could very easily see by the end of week 1, us having a week in which both Breece Hall and Michael Carter look like the exact way that DeAndre Swift and Jamal Williams looked last season when they took on the 49ers and both had like 7+ catches. I could very easily see that based on the game script and the fact that the Baltimore Ravens are pretty stout against the run. Moving on, let's talk about Cordarrelle Patterson. In the 2 games that he played against the New Orleans Saints last year, it was pretty much the same, thread across the way. In both occasions, he very rarely found success on the ground. In fact, he had 13 rushing attempts for 21 rushing yards, a 1.61 yard per carry average. But in one of those games, he had a monster receiving game in which, again, he accumulated over 100 receiving yards and over 5 catches. If you're able to get into that conversation where you're using him as a receiving threat this upcoming week, you're going to find success. But outside of that, I don't want to play any running backs against the New Orleans Saints unless it's maybe Miles Sanders, because that's the only player that I know that can consistently find success against the Saints in his career. So as of right now, we're going to be cautious with Cordarrelle Patterson. As a receiving threat, fantastic. As a running back this week, man, it's going to be pretty tricky against that New Orleans front. All right, moving on. Number 35, Rhamondre Stevenson of the New England Patriots taking on the Miami Dolphins. Again, another one of these matchups that we're fine with. If we were perfectly fine with Damien Harris against him, then why not with Rhamondre Stevenson, considering Rhamondre has even more receiving upside. So even if the matchup is a little bit difficult, it could be something that he can mitigate with the idea of getting receiving work. Now, last season in week 18, Brandon Bolden took on the Miami Dolphins. He had 19.6 total fantasy points in that contest. Last year, ultimately, Rhamondre Stevenson wasn't utilized very much against Miami, and other running backs were. So if, in fact, we're going to transition him into that Brandon Bolden / James White role into this offense, of course, he's going to see himself upwards of 6 targets in this given week and find a lot of success and maybe accompany that performance with a touchdown, solidifying his fantasy role. Moving on to our final option. It really was between Tony Pollard or Melvin Gordon, but we'll go ahead and we'll give the benefit of the doubt to Tony Pollard right now. It's a horribly difficult matchup, but if, in fact, they utilize him in the slot role, he's going to get a lot of targets, because they're going to have to throw the ball for maybe the entire game, just like they did last year where Dak threw the ball over 60 times. If you're going to get into that conversation once again, then Tony Pollard is going to have to be a vital option out on the field, because they're going to have to leave Zeke in the backfield in order to pass protect. That is a given. He's going to be on the field. He won't be running many routes, which may give an opportunity for Tony Pollard to be one of those receiving options in this given week. That pretty much concludes it for week 1 of our 2022 fantasy football season. These are our running back rankings 1 through 36. Thank you everybody for watching. If you have not yet already, be sure to click the like button down below. Subscribe to the channel. We're making daily fantasy football content here. Of course, check out Underdog Fantasy. Use promo code Andrew. And until tomorrow, where we'll be talking about wide receivers, their matchups, and my top 36 rankings, I'll see you guys. Peace.